This lecture will cover crime and public opinion, furthering the author's perspective about the interconnection of social systems in United States culture and governmental operations. We've talked before about the effect of media on the political system and also on people's perceptions of those systems. We showed before that it's somewhat of a feedback interaction where each side influences the other. There has been more of a push that the media is basically doing what the people ask of them, that the government is doing what the people ask of them, but the relationship is really more complex than just the media or the politicians acting in accordance with their constituency. The authors of the Politics of Injustice text key in on some of those specificities, those differences in what the system actually looks like. They say that the public fear of crime has remained relatively stable and in tune with reality. People aren't fixated on crime as much as the media makes it out to makes people seem like they're more fixated on crime. Really, that's just what they're dealing in, because they deal in crime, because they deal with crime stories every day, because they deal with people who are impacted by crime. It might actually seem to them that people are fixated with crime, but the general public at any given time really is not. Additionally, there is not this uniform support for punitive criminal justice measures. Again, it's the people that are being contacted by the media that are actually expressing those opinions. It makes it seem like it's much more uniform than it actually is. Additionally, it seems that the public follows what the media portrays and what type of issues the politicians are pushing out more so than the reverse. So people are actually impacted by what is said in the news, other reports from the media, and also the issues, again, that politicians key in on. Because they view them as important, they assume that what they are talking about is actually important. And it's actually truthful, too, which is an assumption that we can't always make in today's climate. Through this, the media has overhyped the public's fear and concern for crime. Again, they talk with people who are in the immediate aftermath of crimes, or they witness crimes. So it might seem that there is more crime happening than there actually is, and also that the effects and opinions that people have based on their direct exposure to crime is different than people that don't necessarily experience crime on a daily basis. Because of this overhyping of crime, it can have an impact on the way people support various measures by the government, particularly those related to criminal justice, particularly those related to policies enacting more punitive sanctions on criminals. So because you have this overhyping of the perception of crime, overhyping of how frequently crime takes place, people are more willing to do things like punish more severely, put people in prison for longer periods of time, invoke the death penalty. The authors say that public opinion is formed by three major factors, three dimensions of public opinion. First being the fear of crime, that is an individual's level of their likelihood of being the victim of crime, individual perception of victimization. Concern for crime as a social problem, how high they rank that in their priority scale when they're thinking about social issues. And lastly, their punitive ideology, how much support do they give towards increased punishments, longer punishments, defining more acts as crimes, giving people longer sentences. Um, Again, and we've talked about some of the things that impact that media viewership. Uh, Watching a lot of crime-related fictitious accounts. There are a lot of things that play into someone's punitive ideology, and we'll examine some of those things in this lecture. The first thing that we'll talk about is fear of crime. As you can see from the top chart, fear of crime has remained relatively stable. There were some peaks in the early 1980s, some valleys in the early 2000s, but overall, it's relatively stable during this whole time period. Um, so overall, the level of fear of crime in the country is stable. What changes, and we'll talk about in a minute, is the individuals who are fearful of crime. And then, as you can see by the bottom chart, looking at the frequency with which people believe they'll be the victim of a crime. The most common crime that people worry about is identity theft, which can be tied to the common nature of that type of crime occurring, and also the intense negative effect that it can have on someone's life. The next slide has two charts that look at some of the breakdown of the demographics of what particular people are afraid of crime. As you can see from the top graph, female respondents in this survey were more likely to be fearful of crime. Non-white respondents, and the two, well, people start off being a little more fearful of crime and then settle down in their middle years, and then as they get older, worry about crime more often as well. So there are some pretty marked differences in some of these categories in terms of people's worry about crime. Additionally, people, as you can see in the bottom graph, people are oftentimes more worried about particular crimes of which they are susceptible. The graph looks at a particular offense that is intensely weighted towards one demographic being the victim of the crime, and as you can see, individuals of that demographic are much more fearful of this type of victimization. When we've looked at individuals' reasoning for being fearful of crime, that's where the levels of fear become more fluid. So typically, the rates across the country, the sort of macro examination of fear of crime, shows that the levels are fairly stable. But when we look at the individuals who are fearful of crime, that's when the situation sort of changes. And we sort of see that there are a lot of reasons why people move from being fearful to not fearful, and then back and forth. Exposure to victimization, either firsthand, vicarious, through watching it on the news, response to media coverage in a particular area, response to degenerating conditions in particular areas, partly could be focused with the media. So if panhandling, for example, is a problem downtown, maybe someone is the victim of a violent crime, from a panhandler, the media keys in on that, and then the people that see those individuals every day, those people trying to engage in that behavior, are getting hit with that image, and they're also being hit with the media portrayal, and it can really have intense impacts on their perceptions. So while fear is not uncommon, it is stable in the populace, but very fluid at the individual level. The next aspect we're going to look at is public concern for crime. So how worried are the average is the average person about crime in any given month, or in this case we're looking at multi-year graphical representation of the square boxes are percentage of Americans identifying crime or violence as the nation's most important problem, and the triangle boxes are looking at drugs. And as you can see, it's sort of all over the place. Some periods of time, drugs are more of a concern. Sometimes it's crime. It really just goes up and down a lot. And again, a lot of that is based on high crime times. You see the drug spike in the late 1980s, again, with the crack epidemics. Then we see the get tough on crime 90s, and how that's impacting people's public opinion. So it's really just volatile. Volatile is the best word to describe people's or the general level of concern for crime as a social issue. When there's more important things happening, as you can see towards the end of the graph, around the year 2001, both of these concerns fall off when we're worrying about international terrorism following the attacks of 9/11. Okay, so the public concern for crime, as we've just seen, is very volatile. When a public measure like that is very volatile, that means it is fairly susceptible for influence. And as we've seen and discussed in the past, that the political system is very impactful on shaping people's opinions about crimes, concerns for crimes, and then how they vote. So we see major political positions push tough on crime bills, war on drugs bills, and we've seen, again, looking back at the last chart, similar spikes in the public concern for crime during those periods. We've seen the late 80s with the war on drugs. We saw that spike. The Omnibus Crime Bill in 1994. We saw the concern for crime spike, and we've seen similar patterns when we look at people's perceptions about immigration in the last 20 years, more acutely probably in the last 8 years. That's as of the date of recording, the March 2020. The last element is we're looking at popular punitiveness. So how stern are people in their perceptions of how we punish criminals? Do we punish them enough? Do we not punish them enough? What sort of things do we need to do to change how we deal with criminals, how criminals interact with society? One of the common measures that we use for that is looking at the top end of the punishment spectrum and the death penalty. The chart here looks at favoring or opposing the death penalty for a person convicted of murder. As you see, there is more favor for the death penalty, although in the last 10 or so years that graph has gotten closer together. The issue with this comes when you're giving people this blanket yes or no type of question, favor the death penalty or oppose the death penalty. You get this type of response where there's more favor for the death penalty. But when you specifically ask people about other alternatives, such as life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, support for the death penalty goes down. So again, it shows that this level of punitiveness, while it might be high, it might be consistently high, right now, it can be not necessarily as volatile as some of the other measures, but it can be moved. It can be influenced by things like the political system, the media's coverage of this type of um, uh, criminal justice policy. Um, Another element of the popular punitiveness is reducing the perceived leniency of the criminal justice system. This is shown up in political rhetoric. It's shown up in fictitious depictions of the criminal justice system, showing them being very liberal. Liberal judges oftentimes are the ones that let criminals go on technicalities. It could be the prosecutor as well doing the same thing. So we've seen this push to try to reduce that perceived leniency. But really, when we've looked at the level and rate of American punishment, as we've seen in previous lectures, the American criminal justice system is very punitive. It has very long punishments, very stern punishments. Um, so the idea of it being lenient is a misrepresentation that again has been perpetuated through media, fictitious media, journalist media, and also through political rhetoric. Some of the options, the get tough types of options that have been passed, very popular in a lot of areas, reducing people's access to bail, reducing people's access to parole, instituting three strikes laws, making it so more juveniles are punished as adults, are tried as adults, creating harder prisons, which is it would be difficult to create more unsafe conditions than prisons already are. Um, Trying to do cheaper punishment alternatives, which basically meant the privatization of prisons, the privatization of the probation system. Again, reducing parole and things like early release through things like truth in sentencing laws, where individuals have to serve a large proportion of their sentence without the benefit of any sort of good time or reduction for good behavior or parole, and also mandatory minimums, which have reduced the discretion of judges a great deal in a lot of cases where judges really should have a lot of discretion, particularly with drug-related offenses. So some of the roots of this, where this sort of comes from, because the American dream ethos stresses the individual choice and personal responsibility, criminals must have chosen to do these bad acts. You know, it's a hard line. They chose to do this. They had a choice not to do that, and they did that. So they must be held as accountable as possible. Also, the system is set up to put those decisions in place. So through deterrence, by trying to prevent the crimes from taking place, it's thought that people will make good decisions. That's not always the case, but because of that, those deterrences, those prisons, the punishment systems receive funding, whereas rehabilitative programs, things like that, might not receive as much funding. Okay, so the effect of the media in this system, um, they can make it seem like, again, these crimes are happening more frequently. Also, the way they show an individual. Again, we saw the picture of O.J. Simpson that was darkened on a magazine cover. to make him seem more ominous, to make him seem like more of an other to the readers of the magazine. It shows the the criminal often in the worst possible light. It's very difficult to show both sides, even after a crime has taken place, even after a crime has been someone's been convicted of a crime. If they're doing a documentary, say on a high profile case, people oftentimes still find it hard to offer the side of the convicted individual. There's often a lot of controversy surrounding the portrayal of the side of the killer or the side of the robber, because the traditional story that we've had put forward is that they're bad. If they're charged with a crime, if they're on trial for a crime, then we're going to show them as the bad guy in the situation, and the government is the good guy. Because of this constant negative portrayal, people that report high news viewership are also typically showing a more punitive side towards criminals. Again, assuming that they're guilty, taking the side of the police or the prosecution, and that's not a very good situation when you're talking about something like people trying to get a fair trial. In addition, the way that the media covers crime, which crimes they cover, has in the past been overtly racist, and at present does it in a more covert type of way, using buzzwords, keywords, focusing on a particular types of offenders, and it again goes to reinforce people's already held prejudices. The same way that their view about about criminals is fostered and bolstered, potentially negative views about particular racial, ethnic, cultural groups are reinforced in the same way. Again, this has been much more prevalent in recent years related to immigration, and the way that news stories about immigration, not just in the United States, but really all over the world, has shaped people's opinions in those areas where migrants are trying to move, typically to escape persecution, war, famine in the areas where they are. Typically, people don't migrate from their homes in masses when the situations there are good. There is some evidence that people are understanding that the criminal justice system is not the best tool to handle all of these problems that we're laying at their doorstep. That they have a role in this, but there are things that we can do before people get into the system, while they're in the system, and after they leave the system, that are not directly related to punishment. They're not directly related to being put on trial and having labels put on you. There are things that can be used to give people a safety net, to avoid, again, 2/3 of them going back into prison following release. The problem is that a lot of policymakers, people in the political system, are looking for a quick sort of magic bullet type theory, and that's not what we're going to have here. Those are not in the criminal justice system. It's taken us so long to get into this problem that we're at. It's going to take us as long, if not longer, to get out of it. So we have to look at ways we can start to chip away at that 2/3 number, to help people have economic assistance when they come out, have people have job training when they come out, to avoid that small subset of the population to just keep reoffending and reoffending and reoffending. Like I said, there is changing support for using um, other systems other than the criminal justice system, the social systems, economic systems, to address those issues, rather than just focusing on trying to punish away the problems, which is what we've done in the past. So I want you to, again, review these slides when you read the chapters. Um, Again, focus on the things that are coming up in multiple PowerPoints, multiple chapters. Those are the things that are important to focus on in the text. Contextualize this, just with whatever's going on in the world today. What sort of major stories people are focused on? Are they crime related? What has that done to the crime related stories if they're not crime related? And then how you think what you read affects your own perception of criminal victimization.